Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, The Next Era of Energy Innovation. My name is Ronil Dalia, Principal Analyst here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. And presenting today is my colleague, Chris Robinson, Senior Director here at Lux Research. Now, throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the question box on your screen, and time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. And if at any point you experience technical difficulties such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. Now let's jump into the presentation. Over to you, Chris.
All right, thank you very much, Ranil, and thank you all for joining today. So unsurprisingly, as the title suggests, we're going to be focusing on the intersection of the energy industry and innovation teams. And from where Lux sits, we do see a lot of changes happening within innovation teams in the energy industry. We've seen a lot of reorgs within companies, a lot of swapping between innovation models. We've seen some clients moving from decentralized to centralized innovation models, and the other way around, moving in the other direction as well. And so what we really want to focus on in this webinar is a few different things. One, what are energy companies prioritizing from an innovation perspective? Two, what are the technologies that actually align to those innovation perspectives? And most importantly, three, how do you actually go about tackling those and building an innovation function that effectively thinks about these new ideas? And I do think it's prescient to have this conversation today. A lot of big changes happening in the energy industry. And while I'd argue, yeah, that's true, been true for the last 5 years, the challenges today are a little bit more difficult. And that is, I think a lot of what we would say are tailwinds in the energy industry for innovating have turned into headwinds. And this is in a few different aspects. One is looking at the policy and regulatory environment. I'm based here in the US, where obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act was a really big catalyst for manufacturing capacity for new energy technologies, for getting projects built. And currently, a lot of that funding is under threat, right? So the Trump administration is trying to roll back that funding. Even if there are legal question marks over to it, it sends really a clear message to industry that there's not the level of government support there once was. And that's also true internationally. We're seeing other policies like SAF mandates in Europe really struggling to have the intended impact on catalyzing deployment of novel energy technologies. We're also seeing investor pressure shift. While there was a really clear focus 3 or 4 years ago from investors pushing for change from within oil and gas companies, activist investors were taking board seats trying to enact change. A lot of investors were pressuring for developing a net zero roadmap, a plan for what comes after conventional oil and gas activities. And really today, very little of that pressure exists. And it's been replaced with pressure for returns. The companies that were most advanced in their transformation and looking beyond their core operations are also the ones that didn't deliver the same financial results as their peers. They're starting to walk those back. So investor pressure has changed. And also the startup environment is different. Obviously, high interest rates make venturing a little bit less attractive. But then also there's just less exit opportunities for startups. So although there's been a lot of dry powder in the investment community for funding startups focused on novel energy technologies, we haven't seen as much of that deployed. We have seen a slowdown in funding in many areas of novel energy technologies. And these trends are having real impacts. There's a lot of examples we could show here, but Shell's pulling out of a biofuels project in Rotterdam is a great example of some of the ineffectiveness of policy, really despite a SAF mandate, in theory driving demand for SAF, still pulled out of that project, taking a considerable loss on it, just as it didn't see it economic penciling out. Similar case for Equinor scrapping a hydrogen project delivering low carbon blue hydrogen to Germany. Germany is really a industrial force within Europe, a lot of chemicals production, a lot of just other industrial activities, steel, cement, et cetera. And despite the government really taking a very pro-hydrogen stance, trying to develop a hydrogen ecosystem, still seeing some of those projects fail to materialize. And it's not just kind of larger projects from larger players in the energy industry, right? It's smaller startups are struggling as well. Carbon capture canceled what would have been one of the larger DAC projects in development, citing an inability to source low-cost electricity for that project, and some of the headwinds we've talked about as well. So as an innovator, it's really hard to do things right now. It's really hard to do innovation. But at the same time, there's really not much of a choice for it. I'll spare you examples of companies that have failed because of their failure to innovate, right? I think we can all look at, companies like Kodak and Blockbuster, right? There's 1,000 other kind of business school case studies on that. But I'll focus on really two things here. One is this is an opportunity. Investments in low carbon technologies have been outpacing those in fossil fuels since about 2016, per the IEA's tracking, looking at a variety of technologies across renewable generation, grids, low carbon fuels, et cetera. There is a lot of money to be spent on the energy transition. And while capturing that slice of the pie is not really a high margin opportunity right now, and companies are kind of losing money going after that, we're still in our infancy, so to speak, within the energy transition. That won't be the case long term. And beyond that, I think it's safe to say that some of the policy support we don't see right now is not going to last. So this won't be true forever. We do expect that pendulum will shift, and governments will once again be supporting novel energy technologies as well. So you really can't afford to stop innovating. And really, I think the tension between these two things is really driving innovation teams to remain really closely aligned with the core needs of the organization. I think from our perspective at Lux, some of the innovation teams that have really struggled are the ones that aren't directly tied into solving problems that business units are facing, or aligned with corporate innovation goals that come from the CEO and the executive team's office. And we are starting to see some of these changes. We published a report, 3 things innovation leaders must do in 2025 earlier this year. And within it, we looked at what are the innovation priorities of our clients. And really, it's shifted much more short term. 60% of our clients said they're focused on incremental enhancements, near-term opportunities to do what they do better, faster, cheaper, et cetera. 30% were looking for adjacencies, so using some of their core skill sets in existing business to move into adjacent new areas. And about 10% of their efforts were focused on long-term, Horizon 3 innovations that are more disruptive and transformative. So, what I'd like to do in today's webinar is focus on really 2 pillars of the energy industry: the oil and gas companies, which are focused on primarily extracting, moving, processing, and retailing fossil fuels, and the utility industry, which is a similar process of producing power, moving and transmitting, distributing that power, and selling that power to the end consumers. And so these are the 2 industries that we'll focus on. And what we've done and what we'll talk about today is really talking about what are these new innovation priorities within these organizations. Now, to answer that question, we used a few different data sources. One is looking at annual reports. So what are companies outlining as their strategic goals and innovation efforts in their sustainability reports, their annual reports, financial reports, et cetera? We looked at around 80 to 90 of the world's largest energy companies in this regard. We also looked internally. Within Lux, we have obviously a database of the types of questions we get from clients and their innovation priorities. And so we looked at that data and used a variety of tools, things like natural language processing, topic modeling, to try and tease out from those, are there distinct topics and innovation themes within those? And ultimately, we augmented that with interviews, talked with 30, probably closer to 40 or 50 of our clients and other leaders in the energy industry to confirm what we learned through that analysis. And ultimately, the outcome of this process, as we've identified 10 new client priorities, as we call them, which are really innovation themes within the energy industry across oil and gas and utilities. And within that, aligned between 70 and 80 distinct technologies to those priorities across those industries. So what I'd like to do now is walk through those priorities, first for the oil and gas industry, then for the utilities industry, talking about what are these new priorities sharing a little bit of the data behind our analysis, so looking at how those priorities shift across parts of the value chain or within different regions, and ultimately focus on some of the highest priorities, understanding what are the key technologies and key questions that we're seeing emerge within those themes. So we'll start by looking at the oil and gas industry, and these are the 6 client priorities that we've identified. So briefly walking through these, harnessing external innovation is really all about innovation that happens outside the energy industry, right? So while there are development teams within energy companies that focus on some of these technologies, the bulk of the innovations in the materials space, in the digital space, thinking about things like AI, robotics, quantum computing, very impactful for energy companies, but not necessarily developed internally. So how do you actually use some of those innovations to do what you do as an oil and gas company better? We also have moving beyond the core, which is finding opportunities outside the core activities I outlined within the oil and gas industry in terms of extracting, moving, processing, and retailing hydrocarbon products. We have meeting net zero targets, which is really about executing on those net zero roadmaps. And it's less about what the business looks like in 2050 at that endpoint, but as I mentioned with the near-term focus, what can you do today to meet those near-term Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions reduction targets? We have future chemicals. This focuses on the chemicals industry. What are the feedstocks, processes, and products and changes to those that we're seeing in the chemicals industry that have an impact on the oil and gas industry? And finally, meeting demand for energy, which, as it states, is really all about what are the new sources of demand emerging, like data centers that consume a lot of electricity, or changes in demand for energy and switching carriers, like we see in transportation and space heating, moving to electrification with EVs and heat pumps, for example. And on policy and regulations, I'll note we cover policy and regulations that impact those 5 themes and the topics that we cover within them. So getting a bit more granular on some of the data that we collected to support our analysis, we see some changes looking at the part of the value chain in terms of the frequency we see these priorities referenced and mentioned by different parts of the value chain. So for example, when we look at the theme of moving beyond the core, it's the most popular theme across all parts of the value chain, but particularly within integrated oil and gas companies, which does make sense when you look at companies moving outside of their role in the oil and gas value chain. Integrated companies often show up in those types of projects. Midstream and downstream companies are a little more focused on meeting net zero targets than some of the other businesses, though integrated isn't really too far off. And I think that makes sense. You know, midstream companies have faced some of the bigger challenges with things like methane detection and mitigating those methane emissions within transportation networks as well. And of course, refineries very emissions intensive, and a lot of technology is being deployed to reduce emissions within refineries. And then finally, unsurprisingly, the services part of the value chain, service providers, really focusing harnessing external innovation. And they really are oftentimes the linchpin connecting some of the early stage innovations I talked about in terms of the materials industry and digital innovations to actually apply those to oil and gas processes. So walking through a few of these, moving beyond the core, harnessing external innovation, and meeting net zero targets are the 3 that come up most commonly across all parts of the value chain. And we do see these changing quite a bit by region. So while the Americas and APAC look fairly similar in their distribution of focus on priorities, we do see Europe focused a little bit more on new opportunities, which I think intuitively makes sense. They've had generally more supportive policies in activities beyond oil and gas. And when I think of companies that have done the most outside core activities, I think of companies like BP, Shell, Total Energies, all based in Europe, of course, as well. And then it's worth pointing out within the Middle East, North Africa, more of a focus on chemicals. And again, intuitively, that makes sense as companies in that region, large oil and gas companies, have made some pretty big multi-billion-dollar acquisitions of chemicals companies. So taking a closer look at those 3 most commonly cited priorities, Within harnessing external innovations, I touched on some of the major themes of topics that we see being asked about. In the materials space, it's a lot of the same materials we've been asked about a long time. Are there better anti-corrosion coatings, things that are better at withstanding high pressures and some of the extreme environments that you might encounter as a service company in a downhole operation, for example. On the digital side, like probably all of my peers here at Lux, we're constantly asked about, what does AI do for me? And so we're talking a lot about how AI models can be applied to a variety of oil and gas operations. But within this priority, I would also highlight, we got a lot of very open-ended questions. A lot of, what does the DeepSeek announcement mean for me, right? What does quantum computing potentially mean for an oil and gas company? A lot of those, maybe unexpected events or developments are things that we often are talking about with our clients within these as well. Now we have another priority here, moving beyond the core. And I think on the surface, there is a little bit of tension where I say, hey, a lot of companies are looking more at near-term opportunities. So it's enticing to think that they're going to be deprioritizing opportunities about moving beyond the core. I think to some extent that's true, but it would be a mistake to take that as kind of a simple fact on the face of it, right? There are certainly opportunities to move outside the core that are much more near-term focus. Electric vehicle charging is still one of the questions that is near the top of what our clients ask about within the EV space. And especially questions like, could something like battery swapping displace it, right? So we see obviously a lot of deployments of EV chargers today. New vehicle sales that are electrified are up to 10 to 20% in most regions. So it's a very near-term opportunity. Similarly, large integrated companies have been moving into the powering data center space, deploying primarily natural gas turbines paired with carbon capture to actually meet demand for data centers, right? So this is where companies are building carbon management businesses where they are not focused on extracting fossil fuels, but just capturing, moving, and ultimately sequestering carbon for other industries. The data centers is a very near-term opportunity in that context as well. And the last thing I'll highlight here is a really big focus on critical minerals extraction. Obviously, within the energy transition, there's a different set of materials we need to consider that are found in different places, sometimes more concentrated in less geopolitically stable regions. And so there has been a big innovation focus on expanding critical minerals extraction using novel technologies like direct lithium extraction to find lithium and develop lithium projects domestically instead of relying on other countries for a supply of those minerals. And here what's really critical is the tie-in to the core expertise of an oil and gas company, looking at understanding the subsurface environment, understanding how to, essentially pump brines from underground is something the oil and gas industry is very good at. And we also have meeting net zero targets. I mentioned this is less about what does a company look like in 2050 and a little bit more near term. What can we do today to meet some of those 2025 or 2030 interim emissions reduction targets? So within this, electrification is a really key concept. But it's also one that I would say is fairly well understood and is not something a lot of innovation professionals are focused on within the energy transition. They're focused on what comes next. And in that context, obviously technologies like carbon capture are getting a lot of attention, but I also point to things like low carbon heat, right? There is a lot of heat, especially in refineries, that is produced, sometimes wasted. And we're seeing a lot of interest and increasing interest in how do you store heat? How do you reutilize some waste heat that you have? How do you electrify the production of heat in an energy efficient way? And that is something that we are expecting to see a lot more activity on, certainly over the next few years as well. So I want to switch gears. We've talked about the oil and gas side of the industry. I want to now talk about the electrical utility side of the industry. Again, these are the 6 priorities that we've identified in our analysis. It starts with innovating at the grid edge. And this is really all about what happens at, of course, the edge of the grid, right? So not within poles and wires or centralized power production necessarily, but what happens at the meter, behind the meter, that utilities should be aware of. We're also looking at low carbon electrons, which is very straightforward. How do you make electricity with lower carbon emissions? We have enhancing resilience and reliability. So this is looking more so at the grid itself from a systems perspective. How do we reduce downtime in the grid, make sure we're more resilient against cyber attacks, extreme weather events, heat waves, et cetera. Importantly, we have asset management. So really, whether we're talking about generation facilities, poles and wires, what happens in the control room, how do we actually optimize and use assets effectively? And that can range from a host of digital solutions, using drones for inspection, predictive maintenance, all the way through really the key here, the intersection of AI with the power grid. And we have meeting demand for power, which is very similar to the oil and gas priority. Again, what are the new sources of electricity that are emerging? And what are the sources that are converting from using hydrocarbon fuels to electricity? So looking across parts of the value chain, we see some really unsurprising differences. Things like generators focus mostly on low carbon electrons. T&D utilities focus mainly on grid resilience and reliability. But a couple of I think, things we didn't expect quite as much was really consistent concern for meeting demand for power. This is one of the priorities that probably was the priority we were most asked about last year, and it really showed when we were analyzing company reports as well. And I was surprised to see a lack of focus on innovation at the grid edge. Unsurprising to see that occurs most in the retail sector of the utilities industry. But broadly speaking, there's a lot more opportunities for integrated utilities and T&D utilities to some extent, with the distribution arms of those, really thinking about how to better tap into resources at the grid edge. And what was surprising was, again, the lack of change between regions, whereas I think we did see a little bit less change across the value chain in oil and gas and bigger changes in regions. It's the opposite for utilities. So we see less of a change between different regions with a relatively consistent focus across topics. And again, here I think we should pull out the three most important ones, which are clearly low carbon electrons, enhancing grid resilience and reliability, and meeting demand for power. So innovating at the grid edge, I think there's really two important components of this. One is the actual assets that are located at the grid edge, things like EVs, solar storage, and even things like water heaters that live behind the meter that can be energy assets. And the other side of it is more so the optimization part. And that's really, I think, the critical innovation here is how do you actually optimize the use of these assets and give a distribution management system visibility and control of some of these assets to actually solve some of those challenges around resilience and reliability. So here, there's less innovation happening on the asset side of the what. It's more so known technologies and just the pace of their adoption. I would call out things like low carbon heat and the deployment of heat pumps. It's a bit of a challenge just because very inflexible, tend to be synchronized within the grid. And also electric vehicles, which is a massive load, but also massively flexible. And tapping into that flexibility is really the key innovation challenge in this space. So here, this is one area of our coverage where we see a lot of focus on AI. Obviously, when we talk about optimization that's happening at the grid edge, optimization of very complex systems is something that AI is very good at. And so we've been talking to a lot of our clients on understanding use cases and where might AI actually plug into the grid. Within enhancing resilience and reliability, there's really two aspects to this, of course. Resilience is more about how do you withstand, how do you respond to extreme events, can you actually recover from power disruptions and blackouts quickly? Whereas reliability is about your ability to avoid those situations, right? Can you consistently meet load without having power disruptions? And here the main technology that we've been asked about really for the last 10 years at Lux is grid storage, right? They've increasingly been paired with intermittent variable renewables to make sure we have some flexibility in the supply of the power that we're delivering. And within this, everyone's focused on what comes beyond lithium ion. As we add more intermittent variable renewables, we do see greater challenges with maintaining reliability on the grid and some diminishing returns of adding solar and storage, solar and wind, I should say. And pairing with storage helps a lot to address some of those intermittency issues. But beyond that, we also need to think about our ability to move power within the grid. I think everyone agrees we are running headfirst into a very big transmission issue. Transmission congestion is already increasing, and it's very difficult to build new transmission lines. So I think we'll see a lot more interest and uptick in interest in somewhat mature solutions, things like dynamic line ratings that you can do today, as well as more novel solutions, reconductoring, right? Using existing rights of way to get more capacity through them with advanced conductors, or even novel high temperature superconducting wires. They're just raised $75 million recently to develop those kind of solutions. And lastly, second, we have low carbon electrons, which again, as I mentioned, is all about the production of low carbon electricity. And from an innovation perspective, most innovation teams have moved on from things like solar and wind, very known technologies deployed at scale. And instead, a lot of the innovation here is really focused on clean, firm power. So there's a few things that fall under that. Novel nuclear is probably the technology we get most asked about within this theme. And certainly a lot happening within the small modular reactor space, and governments kind of shifting their positions from the last 10 years to be a little bit more pro-nuclear and supportive of nuclear in many regions. We also get increased interest in geothermal. There's companies like Evor, Fervo have been piloting enhanced or advanced geothermal systems. And finally, carbon capture. We haven't seen a lot of successful projects in carbon capture for the power grid, but I don't think that's going to stay the case for a long time. Gas is very helpful for reliability. Its infrastructure exists already. We have these facilities. We know how to build and operate them. And so I think we will see a greater emphasis on some of the startups moving into the low concentration capture space to support gas turbines. So, finally, what do you do with this information, right? So how do we actually think about these priorities and actually drive growth within our organizations as we think about this next era of energy innovation, where innovation maybe isn't as easy and having as much support as it has had in the past? And there's a variety of different quotes I've heard of, kind of ascribed to a variety of different people. So I don't know who originated this really, but there's kind of this principle of when there's a lot of uncertainty, when there's a lot of chaos, the best way to avoid buying into kind of hype is just focus on fundamentals, right? Return on the fundamentals of your innovation process. And when we talk about fundamentals of innovation processes, at the heart of that in the energy transition, I think it really needs to focus on an understanding of technoeconomics, right? Costs are the biggest dictator on whether things will be built or not. And I think we've seen a lot of momentum and a lot of announcements around projects, particularly around things like e-fuels, e-chemicals, where the economics just don't pencil out yet. And a lot of those projects that haven't reached FID might be getting canceled. So using techno-economic models as the basis for your strategy, and using them not just to understand a snapshot in time, but think about the future. What are the levers that need to be pulled to bring down the cost of hydrogen production, to bring down the cost of carbon capture, or bring down the cost of storing electricity for more than just 4 to 8 hours? That's really critical from a modeling perspective. And even for the technologies that we don't necessarily need to model, things like DERMS or vehicle-to-X charging, using decision-making frameworks, things like identifying the suitability of use cases is some of the research that we've done at Lux that you can be more quantitative with in setting your strategy. And these become very important for making sure you're dialing in the timing and the size of investments, particularly when you're looking at some of these more transformative impacts and avoiding over-investing in technologies that just simply aren't ready to scale commercially. Identifying key players is also really important. Before you go out and do innovation, understanding the landscape of who is innovating is really a prerequisite to doing that. And at Lux, there's a couple of different ways we support this. One is Lux Lists. We've built some tools that basically look at patent activity, look at funding activity, and a few other sources of data to build master lists of who are the large companies that are active in innovation in the space, who are some of the small to medium-sized enterprises that are, and then also who are some of the research and academic institutions that are focused on some of these technologies. And then because startups are still, I think, an important part of the energy transition and for innovation teams to be engaging with, understanding within a given space, who are the leaders? Who is a leader from a technical perspective? Who is the most mature scaled solution? Using things like Lux Innovation Grids to answer those questions, help you identify not just who are the companies active in a space, but who are the leaders in that space as well. And monitoring for change, right? Watching for signposts, the assumptions you made when you look at a techno-economic model, right? Maybe you identified that efficiency in electrolyzers and access to low carbon electricity are your two biggest challenges. Are you watching for news events that are supporting that, right? But also looking at early signals in some of these early stage technologies. So things that haven't been deployed yet or in early stages, making sure you're monitoring patent activity, funding activity for any early weak signals that we might be entering a more commercially scalable phase. Those are the types of signals that are types of data that we look at in our Lux Tech Signal, which is a composite score that quantifies innovation interest in given technologies and is a leading indicator of commercial activity around these technologies. So again, an early signal that maybe you need to revisit some of your models, maybe there is about to be a change in the commercial activity around these technologies. And last but certainly not least, thinking about consumer sentiment. Now, I'll acknowledge there are varying degrees in the energy industry of where consumer sentiment is relevant. But to some extent, I think it is relevant to all companies in that the energy transition and the pace of the energy transition will be dictated by government regulations and consumer sentiment, and the two are closely related. I would encourage you to look at our upcoming webinar on electric vehicles that we have planned in March, where we're going to be looking at EV demand. And this is a perfect example of a technology where if EVs accelerate, if EV adoption accelerates, everyone in the oil and gas industry will be feeling those rippled effects as it decreases demand for the core product. So understanding how do consumers feel about EVs as we transition from early adopters to mainstream consumers? What are those pain points becomes important. So concluding for today, before we open it up for Q&A, some key takeaways. One, I want to acknowledge it's a really difficult time to innovate. There's a lot of headwinds you're facing from a policy, from a financial perspective that make innovation challenging. And the consequence is really innovation teams are being pressured to look much more near term. And there are ways, like we talked about with using data centers as a way to accelerate a carbon management strategy long term, to still execute on some of those long-term strategic initiatives on shorter timeframes. And lastly, as we just talked about, really kind of stick to your fundamentals, trust your gut, trust your analysis to avoid kind of following some of the hype around the energy space.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, for this presentation. And we will now be taking questions that you may have on the presentation, which you can type in the questions box. And if we don't get your question on this call, then someone from Lux will be in touch very soon after this webinar. But a few questions already came in, Chris, while you were presenting. And I see a couple of questions around innovation, but rather the impact of the current administration in the US on innovation. So one of the questions was, well, what are the impacts that you are seeing on innovation teams from the Trump administration? Anything you can say about that?
Mm-hmm. I'm entirely unsurprised to get questions like this. There's a lot to say. In fact, we did a whole other webinar on it. I'd encourage you to kind of check out as well. But really, the changes vary based on where you are operating geographically and kind of what horizon you're focused on from an innovation perspective. Innovation teams that are more near-term focused on deployment, massive impacts, right? If you're deploying projects in the US, really this is, it's a time where the funding that was probably supporting those projects really can't be relied upon, right? So that's kind of the group that would be most impacted. Beyond that, I think we've had a lot of interesting conversations about what it more broadly means for early stage innovation. One of my fears is the funding that might impact academic research. I think that's really where we might see a lot of impact on early stage innovation teams. As a lot of we've been seeing actually an increase in partnerships formed between energy companies and earlier stage academic research as well. So there's a lot we could talk about, but I think those are really the two main points. Obviously, an expectation that project funding will erode, and in a much faster, more serious way than we had expected, and I think many had expected. But on the early stage innovation side, being concerned about really some of the funding of early stage academic research and what that means for research partners of energy companies.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps taking a step back from politics, but staying on the topic of innovation teams, do you see innovation teams or innovation activity becoming more centralized, or do you see it becoming more decentralized?
Yeah, I touched on this a bit at the beginning, and frankly, I have difficulty saying if one effect is stronger than the other. Right? I think it's pretty equal in the clients that we've seen. But I think there is really one thread, whether it's centralized or decentralized. The common theme is how tied are you into solving the challenges within the business, right? I think we've seen companies move to centralized models when they feel like they are not actually on the same page, where you have different business units kind of pursuing different things in different directions. But on the centralized side, I think most of those centralized innovation teams that have kind of gotten broken up we're just simply too far removed. They're focused too much on Horizon 3 opportunities. What are these really transformational opportunities? And for that reason, I think executive teams are looking at those business units thinking, or those innovation teams thinking, hey, we have to distribute this. I want you more embedded in the business units, more aligned with the challenges that they are facing on a daily basis. So it's less about everyone's moving towards centralized or decentralized, and more so it's time to rein ourselves in from the kind of the frenzied activity of the last few years, pursuing some really big long shots and being really more disciplined and more focused on solving challenges within the business.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. And there's a question on technologies, which is Lex's bread and butter. But what technologies are trending upwards based on your perspective and your work in this space?
Mm-hmm. It's certainly a broad question. I would say, if we think about the theme of today, kind of compressed timelines, more alignment to the core business, point source carbon capture is one that comes front of mind, right? As we see a lot of these projects in e-fuels, e-chemicals, kind of getting canceled, we see load growth happening really quickly on the utility side. There's a lot of demand growth that's happening. Really carbon capture for power generation is something I think we'll be seeing quite a bit more of, especially around the data center side of things. I also might plug the bioeconomy. I think that's something that we've noticed a very clear uptick in interest from our clients, especially in the last year or so. And I think it is tied to if some of those big long-term things are not as present. Maybe we look at some more interim solutions, and that is where things, like biofuels oftentimes land as well.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent to every attendee via email today. Now, after leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we would really appreciate any feedback that you have to really help us inform and improve future webinars. In the meantime, take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars, and thank you very much for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.